Good evening. This is my presentation. I call it a presentation of admiration. Admiration towards who? Well, the Japanese. And this is why I believe the Japanese to be a super culture. Super culture? Well, why do I call them super? First, let's look at the definition of super. According to the dictionary, it means to be above, over, and beyond, to a great or extreme degree, extra large of its kind, having a greater influence or capability, etc., than other of its kind. I will be focusing this presentation primarily on Japan's super capability to modernize, industrialize, organize, and revolutionize the technological world as we live in it today. I would also like to highlight Japan's modern history and some cultural and political revolutions that have shaped Japan into the country that it is today. If we do a comparative analysis and look at other countries that underwent industrial revolutions, Japan stands unique. What is most impressive about Japan's quest to become an industrialized and a modern nation is the speed at which they achieved that goal. Japan today is arguably the most technologically advanced country on earth. Countless great inventions have spawned out of the brains that inhabit that island. But I would like to start from the beginning, at a time where Japan was still a feudal country. As we've already learned, in the 19th century, imperialism was a dominant Western force. But it wasn't until late 1800s that Japan finally started to catch on. For 100 years, they sat and watched as Western powers tore Asia apart with their imperial practices. So before Japan launched itself into modernity, it stood as a feudal land. It had the emperor, who served a purely symbolic role, the shogun, who was the real ruler of all of the clans and all of the lands of Japan, the daimyo, and then the samurai. Everybody else was just a peasant. That is until 1853, when Commodore Perry showed up with a bunch of large American warships and said, "Japan, open your doors and trade with the world." Fast forward a couple of years later, and then the Meiji took over. So what the Meiji started was the Meiji Restoration period. The Meiji Restoration period is what launched Japan into a self-driven quest for modernity and the avoidance of colonization. After a few armed conflicts and revolutions, samurais were told to put down their swords and they were sent abroad to learn about Western technology and political practices. One of the most influential and socially revolutionary pieces of labor reform created by the Japanese Empire was the institution of internalized labor markets. What this did is it effectively binded the employee to the company that he worked for, but at the same time, it binded the company to the employee, creating a sort of codependency. This piece of imperial legislation was so heavily and culturally embedded in the Japanese society that today's businessman, aka the salaryman, is an obvious descendant of these type of imperial policies.
Because of Japanese labor laws and cultural customs, workers at big corporations in Japan like Sony are being put in rooms to await assignment instead of being fired. Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is trying to pass legislation to change the labor practices and make the country's economy more streamlined by allowing companies to lay off workers rather than keeping unnecessary employees on the payroll.
Japan's relatively low population also contributed towards its economic boom. The low population, in combination with the internalized labor market, created a demand for technology in order for companies to be able to continue to produce. This encouraged the workers to adapt to new, foreign technologies, as well as improve on them, and eventually invent their own. As Japan's industry grew, the nation found itself in serious needs of raw materials. In order to meet these demands, it had to look outside of Japan. Japan's first battle as the newly reinvented nation was against China over Korea. In 1885, both China and Japan signed a treaty that stated that both countries would keep troops outside of Korea. However, after this treaty was signed, the monarch of Korea was unable to deal with a local peasant uprising, so he asked China for help. China decided to intervene and in fact sent troops into Korea to quell the uprising. They broke the treaty. Not only did this really upset the Japanese, but it also gave them an excuse to try out their new military forces. The result was a decisive victory and a test ground for Japan's new national army and navy. They essentially wiped the floor with the Chinese army and gained important access and control over certain parts of Korea. Now, Japan had more material to continue to feed its growing industrial machine. The establishing of internalized labor markets greatly changed Japanese society at large. Japan shifted from a mainly agricultural society to a country that produced goods and services. This was the pivoting point of Japanese industrialization. Japan's agricultural sector did not dwindle, nor was it harmed by its growth of the industrial sector. Japan's government removed taxes on agriculture and placed new ones upon industrial institutions. Furthermore, the Japanese changed government laws allowing peasants to own the land they worked in, which previously belonged to the government. That, along with new agricultural technology, Japan's farmers were still able to feed the Japanese population. All of these factors in combination created the perfect environment for Japan's industrial sun to rise and give way to a new era of prosperity, imperialism, and eventually war. In 1872, Japan built its first railroad. Today, Japan's railroad system stands among one of the most sophisticated in the world. As Japan's industrial world bloomed, in 20 years, their coal consumption spiked by 42,000%. Eager to free itself from the crushing hand of Western powers, in 1877, Japan revoked the extraterritorial rights of foreigners. This meant that foreigners were now subjects to Japanese law and could be judged and trialed for breaking them. Previously, Japanese authorities could not hold criminal foreigners accountable. Small populations require labor-saving inventions. Following German example, in fact closely mimicking their constitution, and establishing a strong central government, Japan decided to once again stand its ground in Korea. This time, it was against Russia. At the time, Russia and Japan had the two largest standing armies in that part of Asia. In 1905, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian Navy, effectively destroying their fleet. This was complemented by decisive land victories over Russian troops, which eventually made the Russian admiral surrender. The powerful families and companies that owned Japan's industrial might were called the Zaibatsu. The Zaibatsu adopted Western technology and methods, but then it improved upon them. Japanese assembly lines were known for their efficiency, precision, and their workers were known for their longevity and commitment to their company. During World War II, the Zaibatsu was an integral part of the Japanese war effort. The Zaibatsu companies met the needs of the Japanese armies, navies, and air forces by designing weapons. Japanese scientists and manufacturers developed some of the most formidable weapons of the time. It is incredible to think that an island the size of California was able to control most of the Pacific Ocean at one point. Their highly sophisticated navy was the terror of the Pacific. Japanese ingenuity forever changed the way that naval warfare is fought. Before World War II, the center of a strike group or a fleet was the battleship. The Japanese changed that by making the center of their fleet an aircraft carrier, allowing them to strike anywhere, anytime. Many of the revolutionary techniques developed by people like Admiral Yamamoto are now used by navies around the world, including England's, America's, and Australia's. Many of their weapons are well known, such as the Mitsubishi Zero, which is an iconic weapon of World War II. Japanese scientists, engineers, and shipyard manufacturers developed 5 super submarines. These submarines combine technologies never seen before and never seen since. They effectively created 5 submarines that, when emerged, could convert into an aircraft carrier. These submarines came late in the war, but their plan was to attack the Panama Canal and the west coast of the United States. The Japanese also developed highly feared fast attack submarines, submarines that were unmatched by any other country at the time. It is interesting and noteworthy to realize that the Japanese got most of their submarine technology from the Germans. However, not even the Germans had submarines quite as technologically advanced as the Japanese. The fast attack submarine could stay underwater for 30 days. And it was the fastest submarine on Earth at the time. The Zaibatsu was presumably dissolved after World War II. However, today many of those companies still exist and operate today. Some under their original names, such as Nissan and Mitsubishi, and others have simply changed their names. Today, the large conglomerate of Japanese technology and industrial developers is no longer called the Zaibatsu. It is now referred to as the Keidetsu. Many of the companies within the Keidetsu continue to develop revolutionary technology which constantly changes and shapes our world today. Among these companies are well-known companies that you've heard of. For example, the company formerly known as Matsushita became Panasonic. The company Kawasaki built many large transports for the Japanese Army. Today it specializes in recreational and off-road vehicles, but it still develops military vehicles. In fact, it is a subcontractor of the Japanese Self-Defense Forces, and it has also been subcontracted by the United States government and agencies such as Boeing. Kawasaki developed or helped develop airplanes such as the C-1 Transport, the T-4 Intermediate Jet Transfer, the P-3, which I have personal experience with, anti-submarine patrol airplane. Other companies like Shibao Electric changed their names to Toshiba. Even today, the designers of the Zero continue to be involved in military aeronautics. Currently, the Japanese have started to phase in the F-2 and F-3 Mitsubishi fighter jets.
武装はレーダー誘導の中距離ミサイルを4発。
Today, Japan enjoys the highest life expectancy on Earth. Today, Japan experiences the lowest infant mortality on Earth. However, one major problem that Japan is facing, just as many industrialized modern nations are declining birth rate populations. When there's a population shortage, innovation is needed to create new technologies which will save labor. Japan is currently one of, if not the leader of this field, robotics. Walking through Tokyo, it is easy to see the past of Japan still echoing in the streets. As Japanese salarymen faithfully ride the train to their offices and factories, these men and women give their loyalty to their companies, and to be fired is oftentimes reason for suicide. It is very uncommon for a Japanese salaryman to change companies once he's gone into one. Most times, Japanese business and salarymen stay with their companies until retirement or death. Today, the Japanese government increasingly discusses the possibility of amending and changing their constitution. Their constitution restricts them from having a military, but nowadays, the Japanese are finding more and more reasons to have a military. China and North Korea being amongst some of the greatest. It should be interesting to watch the developments in the next couple of years to see if these great companies will once again create great weapons. Thank you for watching my documentary. I'm not a real doctor, and this stethoscope is simply to make me feel more important. I'm Fernando Noyes-Vander. and I wish you a great afternoon.